The night over Gary, Indiana had no stars. The cloud cover was absolute, pressing down on the dead city like a lid sealed over something that had been put away and forgotten. The cold came with it, not the clean cold of open country, but the cold of abandoned places, the kind that seeps from iron and concrete that have been standing empty long enough to store the winter inside their bones. Once these streets had shaken with the noise of industry, once the blast furnaces along the lakefront had painted the sky orange every night, and men with lunch pails and calloused hands had walked these blocks in shifts around the clock every day of the year. That was 4 decades ago. Now the steel mills stood as monuments to everything that had stopped their skeletal frameworks, reaching up into the dark like the ribs of something enormous that had lain down and never gotten back up. It was the kind of place the world forgot about, which was precisely why someone had chosen it. Sloan Merritt had known the moment she stepped off the transport vehicle 3 hours earlier that this was bad ground. She had not said so. She rarely said things like that aloud because saying them required explaining them, and explaining them required revealing how she knew, and how she knew was the thing she had spent 4 years keeping to herself. So she had looked at the geometry of the streets, at the angles of the collapsed loading docks, and the long shadows thrown by the rusted overhead conveyors, and she had filed the information away in the same quiet and methodical way she filed everything. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 122 pounds. She wore contractor gear, a vest 2 sizes too large for her frame, and a knit hat pulled low over ash blonde hair. In the green-tinted world of the team's night vision, she probably looked like someone's administrative assistant who had wandered into the wrong building. That was the point. The 6 men of SEAL Team Bravo moving around her were another matter entirely. They moved with a compressed and purposeful economy, weapons at the low ready eyes sweeping their sectors in the steady overlapping arcs of men who had made the same movements 10,000 times. They were very good at one thing, and they knew exactly what that one thing was. Sloan had been trained to do 2 things. She had learned that in her earliest years, before she understood what training was, on the back ranges of a Colorado ranch where her father would set up targets at distances that other men's daughters did not shoot at, and then tell her to put down the rifle and come inside and help him clean a wound he had sustained, doing something he did not explain, and then take the rifle back up and do it again. Both things, always both things. The hands did not choose. The hands did what the moment required. She had been trying to forget that lesson for 4 years. Tonight was making it difficult. The team's communications specialist, Petty Officer Garrett Holt, walked 2 positions ahead of her. He was 28 years old, tall and lean, with the careful movements of someone who had learned in his training that unnecessary sound was a kind of argument you were making to the wrong audience. Before they departed the staging point, he had shown her a photograph he kept folded inside his left glove. His daughter, 8 days old. Clara. He had said the name with the specific, careful reverence of someone handling something breakable, and Sloan had committed it to memory, the way she committed everything to memory, because information was never without value, and because a man who shows you a photograph of his newborn daughter has told you exactly what he is fighting to come home to. She watched him move and thought about Clara and kept walking. The man she was most aware of, however, was the one walking directly behind her. Petty Officer First Class Cole Briggs had made his assessment within 4 minutes of their introduction. He had not been rude. He had simply been what experienced operators sometimes are when they look at a civilian asset being inserted into a live environment, professionally contemptuous. He had glanced at her once, taken in her oversized vest and her careful non-military bearing, and turned away with the expression of a man who has been handed the wrong tool for the run and knows it immediately. He had said 2 sentences to Calloway before they moved out quietly, but not quietly enough. "Dead weight, sir." And then after a pause, "We do this right. We never let her slow us down." Lieutenant Commander Reed Calloway had said nothing in response. He had simply pointed toward the objective and moved. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s whose face had been shaped by weather and operational tempo into something resembling carved stone. He had spoken 11 words to Sloan since the staging point. She had counted. She had counted a great many things since they began moving. She had a habit of counting. It was how she managed the excess of information that her mind collected automatically, the way other people managed anxiety with breathing exercises or prayer. She counted distances, angles, patterns of light, the weight distribution of men under load, the geometry of the structures around them. She was counting exit angles from the market square ahead when the RPG came through. The detonation was enormous in the enclosed space, a concussive wall of pressure and noise that converted the world briefly into pure sensation. The blast picked Sloan up and threw her sideways into the pockmarked wall of a collapsed loading office, and the world went gray and spinning for exactly 2 seconds before she dragged it back into focus through a discipline she had been building since she was 12 years old, her left shoulder. She cataloged it before the pain fully registered, the way a pilot scans instruments in the moment before acknowledging an emergency. Shrapnel. Deep near the clavicle, but the artery was intact. She knew with clinical certainty what a severed subclavian artery felt like, and this was not that. Blood loss was manageable if she acted immediately. Mobility was compromised, but functional. She pressed her right hand against the wound and applied pressure at the precise anatomical point where compression would have the greatest effect. Her jaw locked shut. Her breathing pattern did not change. Around her, the world was coming apart. The team had scattered to cover positions and was returning fire in disciplined bursts toward three separate points of muzzle flash. Calloway's voice cut through the noise on the radio, low and controlled, running the simultaneous calculations that keep men alive in the first 30 seconds of an ambush. Briggs had taken cover behind a collapsed girder 20 feet away and was working a second-story window with systematic efficiency. Sloane's eyes were moving. Not her body, her eyes. They were tracking the angles of the firefight, reading the patterns of fire, identifying the elements that did not fit the picture correctly. Three muzzle sources left, two right elevated. Classic L-shaped formation. But there was a fourth element that no one had addressed, a stillness in the wrong place on the rooftop of the red brick building 60 meters to the northwest. A rectangle of absolute dark where the ambient light should have touched at least slightly. The absence of a reflection where there should have been one. She keyed her radio with her good hand. Sniper, red building, northwest third floor. Second window from the left. He's been there a while. 3 seconds of silence. Not confusion. The professional pause of a man processing threat information on its merits rather than its source. She heard Calloway relay the position to his marksman without a question in his voice. The marksman's rifle spoke once. Brickwork erupted from the third floor of the red building. The window that had been wrong was simply absent, now returned to ordinary architecture. The firefight continued for 90 more seconds before the enemy fire thinned and then stopped. The silence that followed was almost as disorienting as the noise. They moved. Two of the operators guided Sloane through the debris field of the square and into an abandoned textile warehouse 3 blocks east. The building swallowed them, offering the cold comfort of concealment. The smell inside was ancient dust and ghost of machine oil, and somewhere above them the wind moved through gaps in the corrugated roof with a sound like something breathing. Calloway posted his men at the windows and entry points. Then he looked across the room to where his corpsman, Petty Officer Jake Weston, was already moving towards Sloane with his trauma pack open. Weston was 31 years old and quiet in a way that distinguished him from his teammates. Where Briggs was direct and Calloway was controlled and Garrett Holt was warm, Weston was observant. He watched things carefully and said little about what he saw, and the lines at the corners of his eyes present, despite his age, suggested that the watching had sometimes involved difficult material and had been processed in the privacy of his own time. He knew more about the mechanics of keeping people alive than most emergency room physicians, and he carried that knowledge with the same low-key professionalism he brought to everything else. He knelt beside Sloane without preamble. "I need to look at the shoulder." She gave one short nod. Her breathing had not deviated from its steady rhythm since the blast, and Weston registered that immediately. In his experience, people who had just taken shrapnel and been thrown against a wall by an RPG detonation did not breathe steadily. They gasped, or they held their breath in rigid blocks, or they cycled in the ragged, irregular pattern of someone whose body had received a catastrophic message and was still processing the implications. She was doing none of those things. She was looking at the opposite wall with the directed focus of someone who was working on a problem rather than surviving a crisis. He produced trauma shears and cut through the layers of her vest and jacket and shirt. The wound opened up under his headlamp, raw and serious, a deep gouge of torn tissue across the upper left deltoid close to the clavicle, but not into it. He had seen worse. He had seen it on men twice her size who were pressing their faces into the dirt and making sounds that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She was looking at the wall. He began to clean the wound and was reaching for a pressure dressing when his headlamp tracked across the skin just below her clavicle, and he stopped. The scar there was old, fully healed, reduced to a pale, slightly raised line against her skin. It ran in the thin, precise arc left by a trauma surgeon working under controlled conditions. A proper operating room closure, not a field repair. His eyes followed the trajectory instinctively down and lateral to the region of her back, just visible above her clothing, where a larger and rougher scar marked the exit point of whatever had made the entrance. a through-and-through gunshot wound, well-treated, several years old. His hands continued working the dressing, while his eyes continued their inventory professional habit operating independently of social instinct. On her right forearm, almost invisible against the natural lines of the joint, a series of parallel compressions in the scar tissue. The marks left by deflecting a blade in close quarters contact. Defensive posture. Knife defense training at the level taught in a very specific and very limited number of programs, none of which were listed in any civilian contractor profile. He had seen this pattern once before on a Force Recon Marine who had spent 7 months in a country he was officially not in. He looked at his tablet. The file was open on her profile page. Sloan Merritt, age 34. DOI, a civilian contractor. Linguistic analyst specializing in Eastern European and Central Asian dialects. No prior military service. No documented medical history beyond routine examinations. He looked at the scars. He looked at the file. He secured the final layer of the pressure dressing with tape and said nothing. Across the room, Briggs was watching from his position at the window. Not the street outside, but the scene in the center of the room. He had seen Weston's hands pause over the wound, and Briggs did not miss pauses. He did not know what the corpsman had found, but the pause itself was information. And Briggs processed information the way he processed everything quickly, dispassionately, and without announcing his conclusions before they were complete. He looked away when Sloane's eyes drifted in his direction. He was fairly certain she had been watching him too. Calloway moved to the center of the floor and crouched over his map. Their exfiltration route south had been compromised by the ambush. The original extraction point was inaccessible. They were 4 blocks inside hostile-occupied terrain with 1 wounded non-combatant in a narrowing window. He gave them 12 minutes to stabilize Sloane, redistribute ammunition, and prepare to move. It was in the 9th minute that Garrett Holt's hands began to shake. Weston saw it first, or rather he saw the precursor signs before the primary symptoms became unmistakable, the slight forward list in Holt's posture, the way his head dropped on his neck by a fraction, the involuntary working of his jaw as his body began to compensate for what was happening to his right lung. He started toward him, but Sloane was already moving. She rose from the wall where she had been sitting and crossed the room in 7 quiet steps, reaching Holt before Weston did, and she put her right hand on his forearm with a precision that was not gentle and was not rough, but was absolutely certain. Garrett, her voice was low and direct. When did you hit the wall? Holt turned his head. His eyes were tracking slowly. The blast, same as left side or right. Right. Why are you? She was already counting his respiratory rate, her fingers at his wrist on his pulse, her eyes moving across his chest. She turned to Weston, who had arrived at her shoulder, and something passed between them in the compressed language of people who have both spent time in situations where thinking faster than the problem was the difference between the result and the alternative. Tension pneumothorax, she said, not a question, a diagnosis. The blast wave compromised his right pleural cavity. Air is accumulating and it's not going anywhere. Needle decompression now, or we lose him inside 4 minutes. Weston was already reaching for his kit. He did not question her. He had arrived at the same conclusion approximately 3 seconds after she voiced it, and 3 seconds in terms of outcome was not a small number. I have it, he said. I know. She stepped back 1 pace and held Holt by both arms, her injured shoulder absorbing additional strain, her hands steady on either side of him. Both hands doing what the moment required. Neither one available for anything else, and neither one hesitating about it. Weston performed the decompression with the efficiency of long practice. The hiss of escaping pressure confirmed the diagnosis immediately. Garrett Holt's breathing normalized within 30 seconds. The shaking stopped. Color returned to his face in degrees. He stood quietly for a moment, breathing, processing what had just happened to him. Then he looked at Sloane. He looked at her for a long time. My father was Army, he said. His voice was still rough at the edges. 3rd Infantry. He used to say you can always tell a medic who's worked in the field. Not by their equipment. Not by their technique. He paused. By their hands. By the way they move when they already know what the problem is before anyone else has started asking. He looked at her hands. He'd say those are field hands, Holt said quietly. He'd say she's been out there. Sloane did not respond. She turned and walked back to her position against the wall with the same measured composure she had maintained since the doors opened. She sat down, adjusted her pressure dressing with 2 fingers, and looked at nothing in particular. But in the moment before she turned away, Weston saw something in the set of her shoulders that he recognized from men who have been carrying something heavy long enough that they have stopped noticing the weight, and then someone says a single sentence that reminds them it is still there. He filed it. Calloway moved to the center of the room, map in hand. 2 minutes. Then we move south. There's a maintenance corridor under the old canal infrastructure that gives us covered movement for 3 blocks. From there, we reach the secondary extraction point before first light. South. The word fell into the room and Sloane's head came up. Not quickly, not with the urgency of someone about to make an announcement. Just the small, exact movement of a person who has heard something that requires immediate attention, the way a doctor's eyes move when a patient says the wrong symptom in the wrong sequence. Her right hand moved near her radio without touching it. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the warehouse walls, the radio in Garrett Holt's kit was producing sound. Fragments of compressed transmission, each one 3 or 4 seconds long before cutting to static. Encrypted burst traffic partially degraded by distance and interference, leaving something rawer beneath actual human speech moving through the spectrum in jagged pulses. To the men of Bravo team, it was structured noise, something at the edge of comprehension that refused to cross over. Sloane heard the shape of it and her eyes closed, not from pain or exhaustion, from the focusing of someone directing all available cognitive resources toward a single stream of information. Her head tilted by a fraction of a degree toward the sound. Every part of her that was not the act of listening became completely still. The rest of the team was assembled, ready to move, watching her. None of them spoke. Calloway had his hand raised to signal movement. The hand stayed where it was. In the quiet of the warehouse, with the wind working through the roof above them, and the ancient machinery standing in the dark like monuments to a different age, Sloane Merritt sat against the wall and listened to the voices of the men who were waiting to kill them. The expression on her face was not fear, and it was not the blank shock of a civilian confronting the mechanics of her own potential death. It was concentration, pure and absolute. It was the face of a professional doing the thing she had been built to do. Calloway lowered his hand slowly. He waited. Outside, the city held its breath. The radio spoke in fragments, short bursts of compressed transmission, each one lasting no more than 4 seconds before cutting to silence. The encryption had been stripped by distance and interference, leaving something raw underneath actual human speech, moving through the dead air of the industrial district in jagged pulses. To the men of Bravo team, it was noise. Structured noise, patterned noise, but noise with no translation, no access point, no way in. To Sloane, it was a door. She listened for 90 seconds without moving. Her right hand rested open on her knee palm, up fingers loose as though she were receiving rather than processing, letting the sound come to her rather than reaching for it. Her father had taught her that first before he taught her anything about riflecraft or fieldwork or the specific geometry of patience. He had taught her to let information arrive. The world tells you what it knows, he said, if you stop making enough noise to drown it out. She had spent 4 years making noise, building a version of herself that talked about dialects at conferences and filed reports in triplicate and wore civilian clothes like a woman who had always worn civilian clothes. It had been exhausting in a way she had not fully acknowledged until this moment, sitting in the dark with a hole in her shoulder and a dead city around her, listening to men plan to kill her in a language she understood perfectly. She opened her eyes. That's Chechen, she said, not the standard literary form, something narrower. The Pankisi Gorge in northeastern Georgia on the Russian border. The dialect there developed in isolation during the Soviet period, and it absorbed a specific layer of military command terminology from the conflict years. The call sign structure, the Overwatch reporting sequences, the way their unit leader identifies himself. She paused as another burst came through. Their commander uses Sakal, Falcon. His Overwatch element is Volk, Wolf. Calloway had gone very still. What are they saying? They know we're moving south, she said. They know because south is where they would go if they were us, and they understand how we think. The maintenance corridor, the canal route, whatever appears viable from a standard tactical analysis, they've deliberately cleared it. It looks like the path of least resistance because they constructed it to look that way. She looked at Calloway directly. The Volk unit is already positioned at the water tower overlook above the southern extraction corridor. They've been there at least 2 hours. No one responded to that. It was the kind of information that does not invite response. It invites recalibration. Sakal is patient, she continued, and he is arrogant in a very specific way. He is enjoying himself. He expects us to exhaust every other option and then walk toward the one he has left open for us because that is what he has designed. She paused. He is very good at what he does. He has just never had to account for someone who can hear him planning it. Calloway looked at his map. He looked at the southern route. He had just briefed the route that had seemed by every conventional metric to be the best available option, And he looked at it the way a man looks at a door he has been reaching for when someone tells him there is a room behind it he did not know existed. "We don't go south," he said. He turned to his map and began to revise. East, the old city sector. Longer, more exposed on the surface, but no prepositioned kill team waiting at the other end. Sloan watched him work. She had given him what she had, and the next decisions belonged to him and his men, and she understood that completely. And so she settled back against the wall and adjusted her dressing with 2 fingers and waited. They moved in 4 minutes. East through the back corridors of the warehouse district, through spaces that had once been loading bays and machine shops and now were simply voids. The sounds of the firefight receded behind them, replaced by the scuff of boots on gravel and the focused silence of a unit in transit through hostile ground. The eastern route took them underground. The access point was a rusted maintenance hatch in the floor of a defunct substation, a heavy iron disc that opened with a sound like a complaint from the building itself. Below it, a vertical shaft dropped 8 feet to a horizontal passage, brick-lined and narrow, the ceiling low enough to require a slight forward duck from anyone over 5'10". The tunnel was a different world. The air was old and absolutely still, carrying the smell of standing water and mineral deposits leached from a century of brick. Their night vision shifted to compensate for the complete absence of ambient light, rendering everything in the flat, featureless green of a world where shadows no longer existed. The sounds of the city above vanished entirely, replaced by the close acoustics of the passage itself, the soft scuff of boots on a floor that was uneven, and in places uncertain, the faint irregular drip of water somewhere ahead, and the rhythmic controlled breathing of 7 people moving in single file through a space not designed for movement. They made good time for the first 20 minutes. Calloway navigated with his digital compass in a downloaded schematic of the city's modern utility infrastructure. The tunnel network was more extensive than it appeared on the surface map. Passages branched and branched again, running beneath streets and foundations connecting substations and drainage systems, and the accumulated infrastructure of a century of civic ambition, each generation of engineers placing their work on top of the previous without always knowing what they were building over. At the 30-minute mark, the schematic stopped being useful. The intersection they reached was not on any map Calloway had. 5 passages meeting at a circular junction, each one identical in the monochrome of the night vision, each one extending into a darkness that resolved nothing. The digital compass gave a reading and then a different reading and began to cycle the massive iron and reinforced concrete overhead, disrupting the magnetic field into something unreliable. The GPS had been gone since they descended. Calloway halted the team. He studied his equipment with the controlled frustration of a man who has invested trust in tools that are failing him. He looked at each passage in turn. He looked at his map, which showed a single tunnel where 5 existed. He looked at his compass, which was still cycling between contradictory readings. Briggs moved up and examined the junction with the methodical attention of a man who knows panic is a waste of energy. He chose the 3rd passage from the left based on compass heading and went into it. 20 meters in the floor dropped into collapsed brickwork extending as far as his headlamp could reach. He came back. He said nothing. They stood in the junction and said nothing. In the middle of the formation, Sloan Merritt was very still. She was not looking at the passages. Her eyes were closed. Her head was tilted at a small angle, perhaps 5 degrees from vertical, in the direction of no visible thing. The team noticed it gradually, one man and then another, until all of them were watching her in the way people watch something for which they do not yet have a category. Calloway turned from his useless instruments and looked at her. He had been running the tactical calculation for the better part of a minute, and the calculation was not producing a usable answer, and the thing he was looking at across the tunnel junction was the only variable in the situation he had not yet fully accounted for. He waited. When she opened her eyes, she did not look at him immediately. She was finishing something, processing the last of whatever she had gathered, and he let her. Then she looked at him. "The 3rd passage from the right," she said. Calloway looked at it. "The map doesn't show a clear route in that direction." "The map was made in 1987, she said. "I'm working from one made in 1953. The junction held the information without offering any comment on it. "A Soviet industrial survey," she said. "Municipal espionage project. They were mapping American infrastructure in the post-war period. They were very thorough. They went underground." She paused. "I found a copy in the city archives during my mission preparation. It was a contingency exercise. I memorized the environments I operate in, complete maps, including what's below the surface." Briggs spoke from the back of the formation. "You memorized a 1953 Soviet underground survey of Gary, Indiana." Yes. He looked at the passage. He looked at her. He looked at the passage again. Calloway looked at his useless compass. He looked at his useless map. He looked at the 5 identical passages, and he looked at the woman standing in the center of his team with old scars on her skin and a pressure dressing on her left shoulder and 70 years of buried infrastructure in her head. Take point, he said. The words cost him something. Not pride exactly. Something more like the adjustment required when the model you have been using is replaced by a more accurate one, and you are professional enough to make the replacement in real time without letting the cost of it interfere with the function. Sloane moved to the front of the formation without comment. She led them into the third passage from the right, and it sloped downward exactly as she said it would for approximately 100 meters, and then it leveled. The ceiling dropped further, and she warned them, and they ducked and it passed. She stopped at a junction and raised her fist, and behind her 7 men with combined combat experience, spanning more than a century, stopped with her without being asked and held the silence. She was not looking at anything. She was smelling it. Ozone, she said quietly, coming from the left passage. That's a ventilation shaft connected to an active subway line. The active line runs 200 meters north of our current position, which puts us approximately 3 blocks from the eastern district boundary. Behind her, Garrett Holt released a breath that was not quite steady. It was the first genuinely human sound any of them had made since they descended, and no one commented on it because there was nothing to say about it that the sound hadn't already said. She led them on, fork by fork, junction by junction, through the dark underground of a city that had given up everything else and retained its buried network, its hidden infrastructure, the skeleton beneath the ruins. She navigated without hesitation and without explanation beyond what was necessary, and the team followed in the focused silence of people who have transferred their confidence from their instruments to a single human being and are watching that human being justify it in real time. Both hands on the map in her head, both hands doing the work. When the ventilation grate appeared, it was exactly where she said it would be. Weston and Briggs worked together to lever it free from fasteners that had not moved in years. The cool air that came through the opening was the cleanest thing any of them had breathed since they descended, carrying the faint organic smell of autumn and the suggestion of open sky. Sloane stood at the base of the wall and looked up at the opening, and for a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that was not the controlled composure she had maintained since the warehouse. It was the specific recognition of someone who has navigated entirely by internal compass and has just received external confirmation that the compass is still accurate. Then it was gone. She stepped aside for the team to climb through. The sanctuary they found was a wine cellar, not a working one. The building above had sustained structural damage at some point in the previous decade and had been condemned and then abandoned. But the cellar itself, a long, low space with a vaulted brick ceiling and empty wooden racks along 3 walls, had survived intact. The walls were a meter thick in some sections. The floor was old stone, cold but dry. There was no sound from the street above. The team moved through their post-movement procedures with the efficiency of trained exhaustion. Weapons were checked, positions were set. Calloway spread his remaining maps on an upturned crate in the far corner and stood over them with the focused quiet of a man who is not planning so much as recalibrating everything he thought he knew. Sloane found a section of wall and sat against it. The adrenaline was metabolizing. She knew the process with clinical familiarity, the way the edges of perception sharpened as the chemical tide went out, leaving pain and exhaustion in the exact proportions the adrenaline had been masking. Her shoulder was louder now, not unmanageable, but insistent. She gave it the minimum necessary acknowledgement and redirected her attention. She closed her eyes and found, as she sometimes did in the specific exhaustion that follows sustained high-performance work, that the present thinned at its edges. The stone floor became hard-packed earth. The smell of old brick became the sharp, clean cold of high altitude. The darkness behind her closed eyes became the darkness of a mountain night, 4,000 feet above a valley she had been watching for 2 days with her father's rifle against her shoulder and her father's voice in her ear. Thomas Merritt had not been a large man. He had been built by his years into something compact and precise, like a tool refined down to exactly the form required for its function, and nothing more. His hair had gone gray at the temples earlier than it should have, the gift of years he talked around, but never directly about in the way that people talk about the water when they are explaining what drowning is like. She was 17. They were on the back range in the last light of an autumn afternoon, and he was teaching her the thing beneath all the other things. Your hands can do both, he said. They always could. They were made for it. A hand that can find the exact anatomical point to slow arterial bleeding, is a hand that understands the body well enough to know where to aim. A hand that knows where to aim understands pressure and timing and patience well enough to hold a suture line steady for 20 minutes while someone is screaming. It's the same hand, Sloan. It's always been the same hand. He had looked at her with the specific expression of a parent who has said something they know will not be fully understood for years. She was beginning to understand it now. The memory held for a moment the scent of the mountain and the angle of the light and the particular weight of what he was trying to tell her, and then it dissolved at its edges, the way those memories always did, leaving the residue of it behind like a watermark. She opened her eyes. The cellar was the same. Brick ceiling, cold stone, the low sounds of tired men and the distant, filtered presence of a city that had been trying to ignore them all night. Weston settled beside her without asking. He set his kit down and opened it in the methodical way he did everything, each motion purposeful. He cut the saturated outer layer of her dressing away and irrigated the wound with saline, the sound of it loud in the quiet of the cellar. She did not move. He worked for a while without speaking. When he finally spoke, he kept his focus on the dressing and his voice at the level of something not intended for the room. The instructors at BUD/S used to say every scar has a story, he said. Most of them are lies we tell ourselves to sound tougher than we were. He nodded toward the back of his left hand toward a line of silvery scar tissue that ran from the first knuckle toward the wrist. This one, for example, looks like it came from something operational. I tell the new guys it was Kandahar. He shook his head slightly. I got it opening a can of peaches with a K-bar on my second week in the field. Slipped, almost took the thumb off. Felt like the stupidest person on the planet for about 6 months. He pressed a new layer of gauze into place. He was not asking. He was not interrogating. He was placing something of his own on the table with no requirement attached, showing her a piece of his own foolish human history as a way of saying something that could not be said directly. He was making a bridge and leaving it there. Sloan looked at her right hand. On the knuckle of her index finger, barely visible, a pale compression scar, old and smooth. Unarmed combat training, she said. Her voice was low. My instructor was faster than I expected. I blocked late. A pause. I did not block late a second time. It was almost nothing, a sentence and a half without context. But between two people in the specific quiet of a cold cellar, both of them carrying old marks, and the histories attached to them, it was a statement of considerable weight. She was confirming, in the only way she was prepared to confirm it, that they spoke the same language. That the bridge he had built had a person on the other side of it. Weston finished securing the dressing. He did not add anything to it. From the far corner of the cellar, voices. Low, but not low enough. Briggs and Calloway. Sloan did not look in their direction. She looked at the opposite wall and she did not move, and she let the words arrive without giving them anything to push against. Briggs laid it out in the terms he understood. Operational mathematics, resource expenditure against outcome probability. They were down on ammunition, down on medical supplies, down on time. Every stationary hour increased the probability of encirclement. The rate-limiting factor in their ability to move at operational speed was a single wounded non-combatant who could not maintain the necessary pace. The logical play was to leave her, radio beacon water, a medical kit, call the position in once they were through the cordon. Best case, she was recovered within 18 hours. The mission intact. The team out alive. Calloway said nothing during this. He was listening. Briggs finished with, "It's the math, sir, that's all." The word math sat in the cellar like an object placed on a table. Sloan rose. She did it the way she did everything without announcement. One moment she was against the wall. The next she was on her feet and crossing the cellar toward the corner where Calloway and Briggs stood over the map, and she stopped at the edge of Calloway's headlamp and looked at Briggs with an expression that contained no anger, no performance, and none of the social mechanisms people deploy when they want to communicate that they are not upset when they are. She was simply present and clear and very calm. Briggs is right about the math, she said. Briggs blinked. It was not what he had expected. He has run the correct calculation for the wrong variable, she continued. He has calculated what I cost. He has not calculated what I can do. She looked at Calloway. Give me the map. There was a moment, one of those moments where the structure of a room shifts around a new axis, where the hierarchy of understanding changes by a degree that is difficult to measure precisely and impossible not to feel. Calloway placed the map on the crate between them. Sloan put her right hand flat on the paper. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with the focused and ferocious attention of someone who has spent years learning to see rather than merely look. Volkov's command structure is built on containment, she said. He wants us to exhaust our options and then move toward the one he has left open. But he is arrogant in a specific way. He believes he is smarter than us and he wants to prove it. He has been proving it all night. Her finger traced a line across the map. He expects this to end in his kill zone. He is prepared for us to come to him. She looked up. What he has not prepared for is us stopping here. Her finger landed on a 3-story structure 2 blocks north of their position. A former municipal building, solid construction, multiple floors, multiple approaches, multiple fields of fire. We don't walk into his kill zone, she said. We put his kill zone inside ours. She began to explain. As the shape of the plan emerged, as its logic assembled itself in the air above the map, with the clean interlocking architecture of something that had been fully formed before she began to describe it, the men in the cellar underwent a change that was not dramatic and was not announced. It was the change that happens when the frame through which a situation has been understood is replaced by a larger and more accurate one, and the things that looked one way inside the smaller frame look entirely different inside the larger one. Briggs listened. He did not like what he was hearing because what he was hearing required revision, and revision had a coût. But he was an honest enough professional to recognize when the cost of not revising was higher than the cost of revising. And by the time she was done, the column of contradictions he had been cataloging since the warehouse was long enough that accounting for them could no longer be reasonably deferred. He looked at the map. He looked at her hand on the map. He said nothing, but he did not walk away. Outside in the carefully constructed geometry of Zakhar Volkov's patience, men with weapons waited for a team that was supposed to be running. The team was not running. In a cold cellar in a dead city around a map in the light of a single headlamp, 7 people had just changed the nature of the night. Preparation is a form of prayer. Not the kind spoken in words that request things, but the kind enacted through hands and will, in the patient conversion of intention into physical reality. The men of Bravo team understood this in the way that certain truths are understood after years of practice, absorbed until they become indistinguishable from instinct. They prepared because preparation was the only honest answer to uncertainty, and they prepared with the thoroughness of professionals who have learned that the quality of what you build before the moment determines what you have available during it. Sloane understood it differently and more completely. Her father had taught it to her, not as technique, but as philosophy, and the distinction mattered. Technique was what you did. Philosophy was why you did it, and the why determined how completely you did it, and how completely you did it determined whether you came home. Both hands. Always both hands. The old municipal building was 3 stories of poured concrete and brick, solid and derelict. The windows on the lower floors partially boarded the interior staircase between first and second floors, partially collapsed in a way that would slow any assault force by 4 to 6 seconds per person. In a firefight, 4 to 6 seconds was not a delay. It was a sentence. Sloane had seen all of this before she described the building to Calloway. She had seen it and processed it and incorporated it into the plan the way an engineer incorporates load calculations, not as a feature of the design, but as its foundation. They worked for 2 hours. She directed and the team executed, and the quality of their execution was the quality of professionals who have been given a task that makes sense to them and have been given it by someone they have, through a process neither formal nor announced, begun to accept as competent. Briggs ran cable from the walls and stretched it across the entry corridor at shin height, anchored to structural supports. Weston placed mirror fragments at the angles she specified, each one providing a sightline around a corner that would otherwise be blind. The demolition specialist rigged the section of loose concrete above the eastern entry as a deadfall triggered by a pull cord. Calloway coordinated the upper floor positions with the efficiency of a man who has done room clearing often enough to understand both sides of the problem simultaneously. Garrett Holt worked beside Sloane for most of it. He was quieter than he had been before the tunnel. The tunnels are doing the interior adjustment that happens when the body has been brought to the edge of its capacity and brought back by someone else's skill. He attended to each task with the focused care of a man who is aware of how the evening could have gone differently, and the specificity of that awareness was written in the way he handed Sloane the tool before she asked for it, in the way he positioned himself at the angles that put the least additional strain on her injured side. At one point in the process of running cable along the second floor corridor, he paused and looked at her. The look had no request in it. It was simply the expression of someone who wants to acknowledge something and has not yet found the right words, and has decided that the absence of words is its own form of acknowledgement. She handed him the other end of the cable without breaking her movement. He took it and secured it. By the time the preparation was complete, the building had become something other than what it appeared. From the outside, it still looked like what it was: derelict and dark, another empty structure in a city full of empty structures. From the inside, it was a machine, and every component of it had been placed with the knowledge of what was coming and the intention of meeting it on terms that were no longer the enemy's. Sloan had chosen the northwest corner of the second floor where the broken window frame gave her the widest view of the alley approach. From here, she could see the entry point, the primary kill zone, the two rooftop positions on the opposing structures, where Volkov's overwatch would logically be stationed, and the far end of the alley where the blocked route created the bottleneck that would prevent organized retreat once engagement began. She was not carrying a primary rifle. She had the suppressed sidearm she had carried from the start, and her radio and the small monocular she had been using for observation throughout the night. These were her instruments. Her function was not to generate volume of fire. It was to see what the men generating fire could not see while they were generating it and to direct accordingly. Her hands had learned over years of training and more years of trying to forget the training that this was also work. That the person who kept the picture clear while others focused on their sectors was doing something as necessary and as demanding as the shooting itself. Both things, always both things. Calloway came to her position 20 minutes before the expected contact window. He stood beside her at the window frame and looked down at the empty alley. The city beyond was dark and still, the pre-dawn hour when even inhabited places fell to their minimum, when the world reduced itself to essentials and waited. They stood in silence for a while, long enough that the silence became a form of communication, the kind that exists between people who have moved through the same dark together and have arrived at the same place and do not need to explain to each other how they got there. When he spoke, he kept his eyes on the alley below. "Back at the warehouse," he said, "when I gave the order to move, I was looking at the situation wrong." He paused. "I saw the mission parameters and a wounded civilian and a clock running down, and I ran the calculation the way I was trained to run it. The answer I got was that you were a problem to be managed." Another pause longer. "That answer was going to get us all killed at the southern corridor." He said it without performance. He was correcting a record the way a professional corrects a record, with the directness he would have used to debrief any operational error. "What you put together here," he said with a small gesture that encompassed the building around them, "is the best tactical improvisation I have seen in a live environment, not accounting for the circumstances. The best. Full stop." Sloan did not respond immediately. She was watching the alley. A fragment of debris moved in the wind at the far end, and she tracked it until it settled. "My father built things like this," she said. "Now the same principle." She paused. "He used to say you don't set a trap for what the enemy is. You set it for what the enemy believes they are." She looked at Calloway. "Volkov believes he's the hunter. He's been the hunter all night. We've been running and adapting, and he has correctly predicted our behavior at every turn because we have behaved exactly as he expected. We were prey, and he was the apex, and the night confirmed it for him." She was quiet for a moment. People who believe that about themselves stop checking the ground they're standing on. Calloway looked at her, and the thing that crossed his face was not admiration exactly, because admiration has a distance in it. This was closer. The recognition of one kind of professional for another, the acknowledgement of a shared understanding arrived at by entirely different routes. "Get your men out alive, Calloway," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it in the quiet changed the register of the conversation, the way a key change alters a piece of music without altering the notes themselves. He nodded once. The exchange settled between them and became something structural, and then he moved back to his position, and the waiting resumed. The BTR announced itself before it was visible. The sound of its engine was unmistakable, the deep mechanical growl of a vehicle designed to carry weight and absorb punishment, a sound that communicated by its existence alone that whatever was producing it was not concerned about being heard. Volkov was not sending a scouting element. He was sending a declaration. The headlight appeared at the alley's entrance, one beam cutting through the dark, and behind it the massive angular silhouette of the armored personnel carrier, rolling forward with the unhurried confidence of something that expects the night to yield. Behind it on foot, the assault element. 12 men in a practiced wedge formation, weapons at the low ready, moving with the professional composure of soldiers who have done this before and are not expecting significant resistance. Sloan watched them come. She counted paces. She tracked the wedge. She watched the BTR's turret forward-facing, not traversing, which meant the gunner was confident in his forward arc and had not been briefed to watch the upper floors. She noted the rooftop position on the eastern structure, a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, a man with a tube on his shoulder watching the building's lower level. She waited until the last element of the wedge cleared the entry point of the kill zone. She pressed the transmit button twice. Click, click, the world came apart. The M240B opened from the third floor with a sound that was not just loud but physically present, a concussive hammering that could be felt in the sternum at 100 meters. The first 3 seconds of fire covered the wedge formation's forward element before any of them had completed the neurological sequence required to respond. Bravo Team's rifles came online from the second floor simultaneously, the interlocking pattern of fire that the position had been designed to produce, and the alley became a place where survival was a matter of geometry. And the geometry had been arranged in advance by the woman in the northwest corner. The shaped charge at the alley's far end detonated on the 4-second mark, and the section of elevated walkway above it collapsed in a controlled cascade of concrete and steel that sealed the exit corridor. The BTR was inside the kill zone. The kill zone was closed on both ends. Then the BTR's turret moved. The heavy gun found the second floor of the municipal building and fired, and the facade absorbed the rounds in a way that was violent and very loud and sent chunks of masonry through the room at angles that forced the team members back from their windows. The gun was not precise. It did not need to be. It suppressed and it held the team back from their positions, and it gave the surviving members of the assault element time to take cover in the debris at the alley's edges. Calloway on the radio, flat with the particular flatness of a man controlling something large. "I need that gun off us. Now." From the northwest corner, working on it, she was already moving, not toward the window, away from it. She crossed the second floor in a low fluid movement, staying below the line of fire. The BTR's gun was stitching through the facade, and she reached a point near the interior wall where the floor was interrupted by a drainage outlet, a rectangular opening approximately 18 inches wide, the remnant of the building's original industrial function, providing a narrow and oblique sightline to a section of the alley surface directly below. She lay flat. She was completely still. The BTR was 10 meters to her left. She could not see the turret from this angle. What she could see in the narrow strip of world the drainage outlet revealed was the near side of the vehicle's hull, and above it, at the outer edge of her visual field, the armored vision slit behind which the gunner worked. She waited. The BTR's gun fired in 3-second bursts. She counted 2 complete cycles, measuring the duration of the pause between them. 2.4 seconds, consistent. She counted a third cycle to confirm. On the 4th cycle, as the gun finished its burst and began its traverse, she put the sidearm through the drainage hole and waited the exact interval required for the gunner's face to pass across the vision slit while tracking his next target. When it did, she fired once. The BTR's gun completed approximately 15 degrees of additional traverse under its own momentum and then stopped. It did not fire again. The silence that followed the gun's cessation was immediate and enormous. The remaining assault element, already degraded by the opening fire and pinned by Bravo's sustained suppression, lost its operational coherence within 20 seconds of the BTR going silent. Volkov's doctrine, as she had understood it from the radio intercept, was structured around the vehicle as the anchor of his attack. Without the anchor, the structure collapsed at its foundation. The few men who attempted to withdraw encountered the fire that Bravo team redirected from the building's far side positions. Then it was over. The transition from the noise of the firefight to the silence that replaced it was one of the most disorienting experiences available to human neurology, and every member of Bravo team went through it in the same way, the same ringing, the same physical recalibration, the same several seconds in which the body continued at its combat pitch before the signal reached it that the stimulus had ceased. Sloan rose from the floor. She moved to the nearest window and looked at the alley. The geometry had held. The plan had worked in its essentials, which was all any plan could be expected to do, and the cost was not yet accounted for. Calloway on the radio, flat with control, all stations. Sound off. The voices came back one by one. Calloway, Briggs, Weston, Wrecker, the marksman from the western position. Silence where the 6th voice should have been. Garrett, Calloway's voice. Sound off. Nothing. Weston was already moving before the second call was finished, crossing the second floor and up through the gap in the collapsed staircase to the 3rd floor, moving with the urgent efficiency of someone who knows what the silence means and is going anyway because going is what you do. Sloan heard his boots on the floor above her. She heard the specific quality of silence that followed his arrival, the silence that has a different density from ordinary silence that contains within it the cessation of something that had been ongoing. She stood at the window and looked at the alley. She knew. When Weston came back down, she did not need to read his face, but she read it anyway because reading faces was something she did automatically, and because his face in that moment was not ambiguous. He had the expression of a man holding something he has not yet placed down, carrying it carefully because the placement mattered. He stopped beside her. He was on the third floor, Weston said. The RPG round came through the eastern wall. The shrapnel distribution was wide. He paused. He had moved his position from where I left him. He shifted toward the eastern wall. Another pause. The eastern wall covers the approach angle directly above where you were moving during the BTR engagement. Sloane's hands were at her sides, both of them open. Still. He knew you were moving, Weston said. He could see your position from the third floor. He made a decision. The words went in and found the old architecture. The structure that had been standing since a mountain in Afghanistan, since the sound of a rifle from a ridge, she had failed to account for since the moment when everything she had done wrong crystallized into a single specific and permanent loss. The weight of it, the weight she had carried so long, she had stopped feeling it as a separate thing, settled into the place that had always been waiting for it. Clara, 8 days old, a photograph in a left-hand glove. Her jaw tightened. The muscles in her face did not otherwise move. Weston watched her. He was a SEAL, Weston said. His voice level, not gentle level, the voice of someone offering a precise thing rather than a comforting one. His entire orientation, everything he trained for and chose to continue training for, was toward the person beside him. You were beside him. He made a calculation, and he made it the way he made all of his calculations correctly, and without hesitation, because that is what he was and what he chose to remain. He paused. Do not take that choice away from him by carrying it as yours. Sloane's eyes closed for a single moment. When they opened, the alley was still there. The smoke from the BTR was rising in a thin column toward a sky that had begun at its eastern edge to show the first suggestion of a change. Not light yet. The absence of absolute dark. Her right hand moved inside her jacket. Her fingers found the small object in her pocket, the piece of metal she had carried since a mountain and a morning and a loss she had been trying to survive ever since. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was the same weight it had always been, and felt it differently from how she had always felt it before. Her father's voice from a Colorado afternoon, 4 years before the cardiac event, that took him, every hunter needs something that tells them what they are. She had been told. She had simply been misreading the message. She put it back. He made his choice, she said. Her voice was even with the evenness of someone who has found the ground beneath the grief and is standing on it. I'll carry it right. Weston nodded. He did not add anything to it because it did not need anything added. They brought Garrett Holt down from the third floor before they did anything else. The team carried him carefully and wrapped him respectfully, and no one spoke while it was being done. The silence was the team's collectively the shared weight of a loss that belonged to all of them, and that each of them would carry forward in his own way and in his own time. Calloway stood with his hand briefly on the wrapped canvas, one hand placed and then removed. It was the entirety of what he permitted himself in that moment, and it was enough. Wrecker spent 40 minutes working through the BTR's communication system, cycling through encryption protocols, with the focus of a man who has a very specific reason to succeed. And at the end of those 40 minutes, a voice came through the receiver that was American and tired and crackling with distance, and the word extraction was in it, and the word sunrise was in it, and the situation transformed from one thing to another in the space of a transmission. The rooftop of the municipal building was flat tar and gravel, and the cold at this altitude in this hour was significant, but none of them registered the cold in any way that mattered. They set their perimeter and they waited, and the waiting was different from all the waiting that had preceded it, the waiting of people who have come through the far side of something and are now simply occupying the interval between what happened and what comes next. Sloane stood at the rooftop's eastern edge. The sky was conducting its slow transformation through the full spectrum of pre-dawn color, moving from bruised purple through graduated shades of gray and rose and amber that arrived without announcement and required nothing. It was the kind of beauty that appears in the aftermath of terrible things without apology and without explanation, and it was doing so now over a city of rust and ruin and the specific carnage of the alley below, and it did not seem diminished by the context. Briggs came to stand near her. He stopped a few feet to her left and looked at the same skyline without speaking. After a while, he reached into his vest pocket. He held the object in his palm for a moment, looking at it. Then he extended his hand toward her without looking at her. A trident, the gold special warfare insignia, the eagle and the anchor, and the pistol and the trident worn at the corners from years of service, its surface dulled to the matte of something handled often. He kept his eyes on the city. She looked at it. Then she took it. She held it with the specific grip of someone receiving something whose weight exceeds its physical mass. She did not say anything, neither did he. He stood beside her for another minute, then moved back to his position. The sound came before the shape, the rhythmic percussion of rotor blades at altitude growing from a suggestion into a certainty, and then the two HH-60G Pave Hawks appeared against the pale sky, flying low and direct, and the rotor wash hit the rooftop like a reminder that the world outside this place still existed and still had mechanisms for reaching them. The extraction was ordered and efficient. Garrett Holt was loaded first. The rest of the team followed. Weston steadied Sloane's arm as she stepped aboard, and the harness clicked into place around her with the solid, definitive sound of something secured. The helicopter lifted and banked, and the city fell away below. Through the open door, Sloane looked down at Gary, Indiana, at its rusted bones and its long silence, and the single night it had contained, and she did not look away from it until it had reduced itself to a brown smudge at the edge of a morning that was going to happen regardless. She looked at the trident in her hand. Both hands, the hands that had pressed a wound closed and called out a sniper in the same 30 seconds. The hands that had run a needle decompression and navigated a pitch-black tunnel and drawn a plan on a map by a single headlamp and fired one round through a drainage hole in a floor to silence a gun that was killing her team. Her father had known. He had always known. She closed her fingers around the trident. The helicopter climbed toward the light. 3 weeks later, the room was the color of institutional patience, a forward operating base in the Midwest. Pale walls recessed, lighting a metal table bolted to the floor. She had been in rooms like this before, as always on the same side of the table, and the room had always resolved in the same way: a debrief, a report, a return to the civilian contractor life she had built and inhabited and never quite believed in. She expected the same this time. The man who entered was not in uniform. He wore a charcoal suit that communicated neither wealth nor austerity, but the specific quality of someone who had long since removed himself from the category of person who could be assessed by appearance. He was perhaps 60, and his face gave nothing away by default, not because it was expressionless, but because its expressions had been calibrated over many years to disclose only what was intended. He set a thin briefcase on the table and sat across from her. She said nothing. He did not introduce himself. There were two categories of people who did not introduce themselves in rooms like this, and he was clearly the second kind. "Your recovery is proceeding satisfactorily," he said. She looked at him and waited. He opened the briefcase and removed a single item, a black folder with no markings. He placed it on the table between them and did not push it toward her. "We have read the official report," he said. "Lieutenant Commander Calloway describes a civilian analyst of exceptional courage, unusual linguistic capability, and the kind of composure under fire that he has not previously encountered in a non-military contractor." He paused. "We have also read the other account, the one assembled from satellite imagery, recovered communications intercepts, and the debrief of a Chechen commander captured 48 hours after the engagement. A man who, when asked to describe what he encountered in that building, used a single phrase repeatedly in his answers." Another pause. "The blonde ghost." He let that settle. "The official account speaks of Sloane Merritt," he said. "It does not speak of Freya. It does not speak of the operator whose classified service record was removed from the standard system and filed separately 7 years ago, at her own request following an incident in a mountain valley that cost her a partner and resulted in her resignation." He looked at her steadily. "We know who you are, Miss Merritt. We have known for some time. What we did not know until 3 weeks ago was whether Freya still existed, or whether the person sitting across from me had successfully left her on that mountain." Sloane looked at the folder. The room was very quiet. "Gary answered that question," he said. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. "Your father wrote to this office," he said. Sloane's eyes moved from the folder to his face. "Not to recommend you," he continued. "He was not that kind of man, and he understood that this is not that kind of institution. He wrote to tell us that his daughter was the most capable person he had ever trained in 30 years of training people, and that she was wasting herself in a library." He paused. "He wrote that letter 14 months before he died. He asked us to be patient. He asked us to wait until you were ready to make the choice yourself." The room held the information without offering any comment on it. Sloane sat with it. Not the grief, though grief was present, something larger than grief. The recognition that the man she had been mourning for 4 years, the man she had been trying to honor by staying small and staying quiet and staying safe, had spent the last year of his life making arrangements for the person she would eventually have to become again. He had known her better than she had known herself in those years. He had been patient in the way that love sometimes is when it is very certain, willing to wait for the outcome without announcing that it is waiting. He had been patient. He had trusted the hands. He said, the man continued, his voice careful, that someday something would happen that would force your hand, and that when it did, you would know what to do with both of them. Both of them. Sloane looked at the folder. The man did not push it toward her. He left it where it was equidistant, available, and he waited with the patience of someone who has learned that the most important decisions happen in the silence before the answer. The world generates problems, he said, that armies cannot solve because armies are visible, and that diplomats cannot solve because diplomats operate within constraints, and that intelligence services cannot solve because intelligence services are by definition limited to the collection of information rather than the resolution of what the information describes. These problems require people who occupy the space between all of those categories. People who speak the language of medicine and the language of violence simultaneously. People who have been carrying a war inside them long enough to have learned to aim it. He looked at her. You have spent 4 years trying to bury Freya. Gary, Indiana demonstrated that she declines to stay buried. He looked at the folder on the table. We are not offering you a return to your old life, he said. We both understand that life was a kind of fiction. We are offering you a place where your hands are not a burden to be concealed, but a capability to be used. A home for the person you actually are. Sloane looked at the folder for a long moment. She thought of her father on a rocky outcropping above a Colorado range in the last light of an afternoon that had been over for 4 years. She thought of what he had been trying to tell her in all those years of teaching the lesson, beneath all the other lessons, the one that had taken a firefight in a dead city, in a tunnel in the dark, and a man named Garrett Holt to finally make her hear correctly. The hands do not choose. They do what the moment requires. Both of them. Always. She reached out and placed her hand on the folder. Her fingers were steady. When do I start? She said. It was not a question. 6 months later, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Autumn had arrived fully and without apology, stripping the trees along the base perimeter to their architecture and filling the air with the smell of cold earth and fallen leaves and the particular quality of a military installation in the early morning, purposeful and awake before most of the world. The classroom was on the second floor of a building with no exterior sign listed in the base directory under a designation that told you nothing about what happened inside it. The windows looked out on a training field where another unit was running a course in the pale morning light. 16 people sat in the chairs facing the whiteboard. They were not uniform in age or background or the physical type that people associate with special operations. What they shared was harder to see and more important. They were all there because someone had determined they were the kind of person who could be more than one thing simultaneously and had the discipline to hold both things without losing either. The whiteboard read, Integrated Combat Medicine and Tactical Operations. Sloane Merritt stood at the front of the room. Her left shoulder carried a new scar that would eventually reduce to the same pale silver as the others, but was still in the visible phase of its healing present, added without apology to the collection that mapped the history she had stopped apologizing for. She was not wearing civilian clothes in the way she had worn them before, as a costume for an identity maintained at the cost of the one underneath it. That version of her had served its purpose. She did not mourn it. She looked at the 16 people in front of her. Hands, she said. Hold them up, both of them. 32 hands rose. She looked at them. Those hands will carry a rifle and a tourniquet, sometimes within 30 seconds of each other. They will start an IV and chamber a round. They will close a chest wound and hold a firing position. Not because you will be asked to do 2 jobs, but because the job is one job and it has always required both things. The moment you start thinking of them as separate is the moment you become less than what you could be. She let that sit. Your hands are going to learn to do both, she said. Not one or the other, both. That is the entire course. A candidate in the front row, a young corpsman with attentive eyes, said, Your father taught you. It was a statement the kind that emerges when someone has been briefed on a background and cannot contain their curiosity about the person in front of them. Yes, Sloane said. The room waited. He spent 20 years proving that the hands could do both, she said. And then he spent the last year of his life making sure someone would teach it to the next generation. She looked at the candidate and then at the others, all 16 of them, their 32 hands still in the air. That is why we are here. She turned to the whiteboard and began. That evening, she called her mother. She had been calling more regularly in the past 6 months, not from obligation, but from the reconstruction of something that had been taken apart in the years of building the wall around Freya and had now slowly and imperfectly been put back together. Her mother's voice on the phone carried the quality of voices that have been waiting patiently for a long time and have retained all of their warmth in the waiting. They talked for 40 minutes about the teaching and the students and the autumn at Fort Bragg, which was, her mother said, nothing like Colorado but had its own qualities. At the end of the call, after a pause that held the particular weight they had both learned not to rush past her, Mother said, "Your father would be proud of you." Sloan held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Outside the window, the base was going about its evening in the way that military installations go about their evenings, with the lights across the field and the distant sounds of a place that never entirely quiets. On the table in front of her, two objects: the piece of metal Tom Merritt had given her after her first confirmed kill, the small carved shape worn smooth from years of handling, which had once been a reminder of loss and was now a compass. His voice in it specific and clear. Every hunter needs something that tells them what they are. She understood now what he had meant her to understand, that what she was not a thing to be ashamed of, or buried, or managed. It was a thing to be aimed, a capability to be used in service of something worth serving. The hands that could do both things. And beside it, the black folder opened its current contents, describing the parameters of what came next. She had read it 4 times already. She would read it once more before she slept. She reached out and placed her hand on it, both hands flat on the table now, and she sat for a moment in the way her father had taught her to sit with things, letting the information arrive rather than reaching for it, feeling the specific weight of the future, which was not a burden and was not a promise, and was simply, as it had always been, the next thing the moment required. She was ready. She had, in a sense, always been ready. She had simply needed a dead city and a long night in a tunnel through the dark and a man named Garrett Holt to hear the lesson she had been taught 20 years ago in the last light of a Colorado afternoon. Both hands. Always both hands. Outside the window, Fort Bragg continued its work in the autumn dark. Tomorrow, 16 students would return to the classroom, and she would be there before them with her coffee and her open folder and the specific quality of patience that her father had given her, the patience of someone who is certain of the outcome and is content to wait for the students to arrive at it. Briefing at 7 in the morning. She was already ready for it. The window reflected her face back to her in the dark glass, pale and clear, and composed the face of a person who has come through a long and complicated darkness and has arrived not at the end of something, but at the beginning. Freya was not hiding. She was not running. She was sitting at a table in North Carolina in the autumn of a year that had cost her considerably and given her considerably in return, and she was looking at the work ahead of her with the steady and unhurried attention of someone who understands that the hands do not rest and does not want them to, and has finally made her peace with what she is. The folder was open. The next page was waiting. She turned to it.